Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny-state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and this is the show where myself and Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs discuss the latest in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. In this episode, we're joined by the stand-up comedian Geoff Norcott to discuss the war on sugar, why Brits are drinking less booze, and the case for legalising cannabis. Hello and welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny-state. My name's Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and I'm joined as ever by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And we're delighted to be joined today by a very special guest. He's a fantastic stand-up comedian. You'll have seen him on the MASH Report as well as live at the Apollo and on his new hit podcast, What Most People Think. Geoff Norcott, thanks.
How's it going? You all right?
Not too bad. Thanks for being with us.
I just hearing the IEA immediately, I'm like, I want to say, who funds you? So, are you
Who
allowed
does
to
fund you, actually?
We'll discuss it later on. All be revealed.
To kick things off, let's talk about the big political story of the last month, and that is Labour's Tom Watson having a pop at Tony the Tiger. So earlier this month, he was at a conference of the Advertising Association. He's really taken on sugar as his kind of latest crusade, having shed a lot of weight himself over the past year. And he said that refined sugar is deadly and that using playful characters to advertise sugary children's breakfast cereals was deeply irresponsible. He raised the familiar story that we've talked about a few times about childhood obesity, rotting teeth apparently being something which is coming back with a force. But really this just feels like the latest salvo, I think it's fair to say, in the war on sugar since the sugar levy and various other proposals we've seen come through to try and warn us off this crack cocaine-like substance, as some would have it. So Chris, does Tom Watson have much of a point insofar as there being this problem of sugary cereals, childhood obesity, teeth rotting out of their mouths? Is there any truth to any of this picture?
To be honest with you, he blocked me on Twitter a few years ago, so I'm not fully aware of everything he's been saying. I know he's fallen in with a bad lot with Asi Malhotra and the Action on Sugar people and so on. And it's a classic thing of, it's like the ex-smoker lecturing everybody about smoking. He's done very well to lose all that weight, so fair play to him. But I do think you play a dangerous game when you start making weight loss a kind of defining feature of your identity, because about 80% of people who lose a lot of weight through dieting put it back on within 5 years. So he's under a lot of pressure now, isn't he? Because he's lauding.
It's like when new people release a fitness DVD, isn't it? You're like, oh, you've done it now.
You're committed for life, aren't you? It's not just a quick paycheck doing the old DVD workout. So I mean he's one of many, isn't he? Banging on about sugar. We've had it for 5 years now. The Frosties cereal ban, getting rid of Tony the Tiger. That was something that Andy Burnham first came up with about not that long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I think, during the Ed Miliband era. And pretty much everyone found that hysterically funny, that Andy Burnham wanted to get rid of Tony the Tiger. And now it's not quite government policy, but certainly Labour Party policy, I think. And it's been done in Chile. Chile have banned all kinds of things. They've more or less got plain packaging for cereal, actually, over there. Not just cereal, but anything with sugar, salt and fat. You can't put children's characters on it. So their equivalent of Frosties is just a blue box that says Frosties on, basically. Good on Tom Watson for losing that weight. I hope he keeps it off. Statistically, he probably won't. But it doesn't make you an expert on nutrition. That's what people need to realise. And that's the maddest thing about this whole obesity area. Obviously, I write about smoking and vaping and gambling and all that. And you can kind of predict what the campaigners are going to say. But when it comes to nutrition, it's just thousands of different people who've all lost weight in different ways. They all think they've got the silver bullet. And naturally, of course, they contradict each other all the time, which is a very good reason why we shouldn't be setting government policy on food, because even the serious science is pretty shaky. We don't really know what we're doing, but we're messing around in the food supply. We can't blame a single nutrient for obesity or anything else. And it's really kind of fatuous to pretend we can.
Geoff, what did you make of all of this?
Well, the thing is he lost that weight without government or state interventions. That's what bugs the shit out of me. Is that he did that. He found it within himself as a person. He took individual responsibility for his weight, with the full glare of all sorts of cartoon characters staring back at him every single time he went into the supermarket. But he averted their gaze, their sugary gaze, and he just went ahead and did it. And then it's almost like this patrician politics that often comes from the liberal left now, is that they think what I'm able to do do, you can't do. And he's trying to become like the Jamie Oliver of politics. And just look at how people feel about Jamie Oliver. It's not a great way to go. And I lost a lot of respect for him, actually. So I made a note of what he called it here, this proposal as well about fizzy drinks, right? Called it Fizz-Free February.
Oh, yeah.
Look, first up, not everything needs a name, okay? Yeah? Like flexitarians and all this crap that everyone wants a sort of identity now. It doesn't need to have a name. Why does it have to be a whole month, right? Why? He's just gone with the sort of establishment view of these things, that you have to name it after a month. If he was smart, you'd have said Fizz-Free Friday. That would mean people having more days in the year where they didn't have sugar. But he sort of attached himself to this Movember, Stoptober crap.
And it's a busy one anyhow, February. There's already D-Chocks in February and Flutter-Free February.
Why don't you just kill yourself on the 2nd of February? That's one way of keeping the weight off, isn't it?
But on that point, Chris, in particular, it's really quite strange. I mean, there's a lot going on in politics right now, and yet Tom Watson's header image on Twitter, I know you won't be able to see it because you're blocked, is Fizz-Free February. His pinned thing is him with a bunch of school children talking about this. What is it about, as Geoff was saying, particularly the Labour left, particularly the Labour Party, who seems to have become over the years more and more obsessed with what people are eating? When did that shift take place, do you think? 'Cause I know you've studied the history of all these kinds of things.
Well, it beats talking about anti-Semitism, doesn't it? And all the other things that...
Or accusing dead people of being paedophiles.
Yeah.
I mean, he's really had a change of tack in terms of what his campaign...
Not enough people remember that. That's it.
He's moved on in some respects, hasn't he? He's moved forward.
Yeah.
For the Labour Party, as with all the other parties, and it's not like the Tories are any better, as far as I can see on this issue, it's almost like light relief. You know, things are so heavy at the moment with all the stuff going on, but obviously mainly with Brexit, but other things as well, that it's a nice, cheap, easy win. You know, we've just had this, I know it's a slightly different issue, but this presumed consent for organ donation just gone through. It was passed last year. It's been introduced today. We know for a fact that it doesn't work. They tried it in Wales a few years ago. It has the unintended consequence of getting a whole load of people who could be given their organs to put themselves on a register where they can never donate. In the old days, well, before last week, basically, what would actually happen? You never needed an organ donor card. If you died tragically in a motorcycle accident, they'd just go to your wife or your parents, and if they said it was all right to take your organs, then you could take the organs. All that this stupid presumed consent thing has done is meant like 10% of the population write themselves off forever. So it doesn't work in Wales, but they brought it in England. My point in bringing this in is because even though the evidence is completely against it, it's a feel-good thing. It sounds quite a nice thing. It's a bold move.
I was in favour of that, but I didn't know much about it. But it made me feel good, like the idea of it, that it would improve things. But I didn't scratch beneath the surface of it.
Yeah, well, nor did the politicians. You know, it's not our job to know all about it. I didn't know about it until quite recently, when I realised that actually the number of donations in Wales had gone down since they brought in presumed consent. But you'd think that, you know, they consult on these things. They have parliamentary scrutiny. Somebody might have noticed it. It's been reported by the BBC that they didn't have an increase in donations.
Why do people not want to give there? It's a really weird idea. You know, particularly as we're quite a secular society. I understand if there's a faith-based dimension for it, but just sort of zealously holding on to your...
Well, you're going to get a few libertarians now putting themselves on the register just in protest at the government, because some libertarians, didn't really bother me, but some libertarians really think it's unethical for the government to claim ownership of your body when you're
by default, which is a kind of fair enough.
And so I've had people today tell me, you know, I'm going to take
like
I've got a card, I'm going to rip it up.
Yeah.
It's like nationalising dead organs in a way, isn't it?
But what they should do is privatise them and let you sell them for money.
That's
the most libertarian thing you've ever said.
It works.
But moving away from selling organs for a second.
Selling dead people's organs. Dumb dead paedophiles already.
We should sell dead paedophiles' organs.
It's my kind of podcast.
But Geoff, you're obviously famous for being that very rare species of a openly right-of-centre comedian. Do you think it's this kind of nanny-state stuff that on some level does put people off of Labour, the fact that they seem to spend an enormous amount of time talking about breakfast cereals, for instance?
I don't know if it puts people off enough. I think that the things people are put off about Labour at the moment aren't this. I think that there's this weird willingness among young people to have this level of intervention in their life. We live in a culture where something like iTunes and a lot of the subscriptions we have, every couple of weeks they update their services, terms and conditions, and we blithely sign them away. And I wonder if that started to permeate people's brains in a way, this sort of abstract overlord that just has control, and as long as they don't do anything overtly horrible to you for the time being, you're willing to give up a hell of a lot in terms of your own personal information. So that's a concern to me, that people, I was thought kind of being artistic was about, you know, a sort of a rampant individual, you know what I mean? Like you had a really interesting take on things, but yet when it comes to these sort of issues, people have a surprisingly ambivalent take on the way that the state is just sort of lurching into your private life more and more.
Mm. And Chris, just to finish off this section, the main thing that really Tom Watson is getting at here is this kind of childhood obesity epidemic. And I know you have some, shall we say, heterodox views on this, because it gets raised time and time again.
Jargon
sort of against the grain, really, on this particular issue.
The truth. Yeah, I know.
So what is the truth about the supposed kind of obesity epidemic amongst children?
There's nowhere near as many of them as people make out. I was on the radio very recently against a doctor who is also a member of the London Assembly for Labour, asserted twice that 40% of children in London are obese. I mean, how can anyone believe this?
Is that relative obesity? Like relative poverty? well, those people are really skinny, so relatively he's a fat little fucker.
It's actually defined in an even worse way than relative poverty. It makes the relative poverty measure seem perfectly sensible, actually. I'm not going to go into it now because it's a long story, but I've written about this for Spectator Health if anybody wants to check out what I've said about it. What I say is incontrovertible. It is surely a striking fact that the number of obese people more than halves between the ages of 16 and 18, and that's because we define it and measure it in a totally different way. There's no conceivable way in which obesity is going to fall, actually, as people get older. It always rises as people get older. It's certainly not going to more than half. It's a con. There is nowhere near as many obese children as the statistics claim, and there certainly aren't 40% of kids in London who are obese. And I don't understand how anyone can believe otherwise. How can you walk around?
To me, instinctively, the fat kids are fatter. Do they
at the top end?
Do they skew the averages, the absolute big ones?
There's still about one per class, though, which is what it's always been, right? That might be.
I mean,
that one might be bigger.
One huge, right? Just on a pure statistical level, are we getting out the winch for that one kid?
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the show so far. So, as Spiked readers and listeners to this podcast will know, Spiked has no paywall and no subscriptions. It's contributions from our readers, from our listeners, that keep us going and growing. So to those who already give, thank you very much. And if you'd like to make a donation, or even better, set up a monthly donation, just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button in the top right of the homepage. Anything you can give really is greatly appreciated. Now, back to the show. Let's move on to alcohol, because this month some interesting statistics came out on alcohol from the Office for National Statistics. It sparked a bit of confusion, I think it's fair to say, and some contradictory headlines. So the Daily Mail ran a front page on the basis of these ONS statistics, pointing out that drink consumption had fallen significantly, while at the very same time the Independent ran with the news that alcohol-related deaths had actually reached an all-time high. And it actually turns out that both are right. So these statistics found that the proportion of adults in England who consume more than 14 units a week fell from 26% in 2011 to 21% in 2016. But it also shows that the number of alcohol-specific deaths has risen to 5,843, which is the highest on record. So, Chris, I know you wrote about this. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? How can these two things be right at the same time, given the conventional wisdom has always been if alcohol consumption drops across the board, then these problems at the worst end would decrease as well?
Well, it's because the conventional wisdom is wrong again. It's good that the Daily Mail has noticed that alcohol consumption's fallen. It's only taken them 15 years to do it. Is this now common knowledge? You're aware that alcohol consumption's fallen?
No, I suppose I was aware that people in general are becoming slightly more abstemious than we think. Yeah.
Well, it's fallen by nearly 20% since 2004. Wow. And most of that fall happened between sort of 2004, 2012, or something like that. So it's really quite steep, the steepest fall since the war. And as Tom says, the same day this latest bit of news about we're drinking much less than before was put forward in the Mail, the Independent said that alcohol-related deaths have risen to a record high, which is true in pure absolute terms. If you measure it in terms of age standardised per 100,000, which is how you should really do it, it's sort of joint highest. But let's not split hairs. It's higher than it's been for a very, very long time. And this would surprise people in public health if they acknowledged it. I don't think it would particularly surprise the man on the Clapham omnibus. There's no particular reason to think that overall average consumption is going to be linked in any way to the number of alcoholics. in the land. The only slight connection is that actually heavy drinkers consume such a disproportionate amount of the alcohol in the country that if you reduce the number of heavy drinkers, per capita consumption will probably decline. They've got sort of, I can't remember what the figure is, but it's kind of a 18-20 rule as you get in a lot of markets. The only reason to bring it up really is that there is this belief, which borders on dogma in public health, that there is such a thing as a single distribution, is what they call it, which means if you can picture a bell curve of consumption of anything, but in this instance, alcohol, you've obviously got a lot of people drinking nothing at all. You've got a small number of people at the tail on the right-hand side drinking a huge amount, and then you've got your median drinker, your average drinker in the middle. And the belief in public health is that in order to reduce the number of heavy drinkers, and therefore the amount of alcohol-related mortality and harm, you need to shift the entire bell curve. In other words, you need to shift the median drinkers, the average drinkers' consumption. You need to get light drinkers to drink even less. You need to get moderate drinkers to become light drinkers, and so on. And that justifies policies which basically target normal, moderate drinkers. So it's things like, we need to put the price up a bit. We need to have minimum price. We need to ban advertising. We need to restrict licensing. And people will complain, this is going to, have an effect, have a negative impact on, normal, safe drinkers. And public health people will say, but everyone will benefit because it will move this distribution to the side. And the mere fact that consumption has fallen so much over the last 15 years and alcohol-related deaths are at a record high is pretty compelling evidence that this theory is bollocks. And of course it is. And it's always been bollocks. And yet the same theory is applied to salt and to calories and to all kinds of different things. And it doesn't stack up across any of these areas. And this sounds like a kind of arcane academic point, and in a way it is. But that's because you don't appreciate quite how ingrained this idea is in public health.
No, but I mean, it totally lands with me as an idea. If anything, I don't know if it's an over-familiar sort of analogy, but when I was a teacher, I would have the naughty kid, and it was much easier to keep the whole class back than risk the wrath of the naughty kid. So everyone would have to pay the price for the actions of one person. And I will do a tour plug here, but it is totally related. It's the tour that I'm sort of going on sale for this autumn. It's called Taking Liberties, right? And some of it is just about being a cheeky stand-up, but some of it is about stuff like this. It's about people government getting in your business and trying to affect these small changes in behaviour, which are quite irrelevant, which on a localised level for me means that I have, I enjoy less drinks with my meal, but overall probably needed antidepressants again. Like if you keep stripping out all this fun stuff, I don't think this behaviour goes anywhere as well. Like if you look at the I know like the high stakes gambling thing had quite a lot of cross-party support, but my thought with that, right, is if you have a sweeping policy that says you can't do this anymore or it costs more, where does that behaviour go? Because that behaviour comes from somebody's personality, right? It's an underlying issue. So obviously the reason they like high stakes gambling machines is because they like the adrenaline rush and the risk. My theory is that probably goes somewhere else, So if you
go online,
probably. And if alcohol becomes, or you start abseiling without fucking robes or whatever, And my theory, you make certain alcohol sort of doubly more expensive. People might look at certain painkillers that have a similar effect. I think that it is symptom management to an extent.
Yeah, it was targeting people who are least likely to fight back. For a start off, if you're in the field of alcohol, there are of course alcohol charities and they do deal with alcoholics and good on them. It's a very difficult job, but because it's such a difficult job, quite a thankless job, and very frequently a totally unsuccessful job because a lot of these people just don't want to change. It's much easier for public health to go, right, we're going to, instead of doing that, getting our hands dirty with people who are going to show us the door in no uncertain terms, we're going to form a pressure group and we're going to start going to the party conferences and we'll start lobbying for higher taxes on spirits or minimum pricing or a ban on advertising, which is much, much more fun for them to do. And they feel that they've taken a bold step. And going back to the previous question about why do politicians do this, they feel they've taken a bold step and they're in the newspapers for a while and none of it does any good. It just hassles the majority, doesn't do anything to help the minority. But it's this single distribution theory, this whole population approach, it's a self-serving conceit. And it's self-serving because it justifies them targeting people who are actually no harm to themselves or anybody else,
Yeah.
but are not going to give them a lot of grief. In the same way as it's a lot easier for the police to go around hassling some farmer with his shotgun rather than going out after yardies with, with pistols.
But on that point, because we've talked a lot about how, in some respects, it feels like a lot of public health people aren't necessarily always concerned with the people who have the worst problems. It is they do have a puritanical outlook in general. They don't like the fact that people drink. They don't like the fact that people take to excess. So do you think that's a part of it as well as this, which is that...
The Puritan thing is massive. I was looking over some old notes the other day because obviously I've got to write a new stand-up show. I was feeling a bit desperate. And I just had this note in 2014 that just said, the Puritans are coming. Now, occasionally, I'm a bit ahead of the curve, but I didn't know how to express that. But I just kind of was doing a bit of maths about the way that young people tend to go and a few early sort of indicators. But the risk is, and this is sometimes a thing that happens to the Labour Party and the left as well, is that if you think virtue is on your side, it can sometimes make you so blind to the worst excesses of whatever that crusade is. And there's governments rarely give stuff back. Like, so if they're able to tax more because of what is seen to be a temporary public health problem, it's very rare they've got, oh, by the way, busy as we are, we've actually looked at a few old taxes and we thought we're charging too much for that. Have a few of those back. And that's what always worries me, is this creep into our private lives. So, for example, what happens, right, if the society changes completely, but these taxes are still at an elevated rate, you then have a taxation system that's completely at odds with drinking culture generally. It would never reverse.
They should offer some tax back, you're right, because they're always pushing these policies on the basis of this is going to save the NHS billions of pounds, right? At the moment, obesity, whatever, alcohol, these cost £16 billion, right? These insanely high figures. And we think a sugar tax and reformulation and this advertising ban and taking Tony the Tiger off cereal and so on, this is going to do the trick, it's going to work. They should put the money where the mouth is and say, okay, right, you can do that. We should say to them, you can do that. We want 2p off income tax, right? You're saving this money. We want it back. But as you say, it never happens because actually it wouldn't save any money, even if it worked, which it doesn't.
But it's so cultural as well. Like when I look at sugar and the way people go at that, they always tend to go for the corporations that give them a hard-on to attack, generally, you know, whether it's McDonald's or Coca-Cola. Yeah, when it comes to straight sugar, look at the kind of things they sell in any coffee shop. Do you know what I mean? Like that platter that they offer at the front. Look at the sugar content of that. But they're never held. No one's going after Costa, are they, for the sugar content of what they sell?
Oh,
so some of it is
Action on Sugar been going after the coffee shops.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
There's
no escape from them. But you're right about the smaller ones. They will go for the big corporations.
Yeah, because they sort of get, you know, they get off on the idea of that. And you look at actually like something like McDonald's and just their basic menu calorifically, it's not the worst in the world. You know, there's so many other things you can eat that would give you more salt, more calories, more fat. But I guess it's not sexy, is it, to go after, you know, certain restaurant or pizza chains? But it is when it comes to McDonald's.
Yeah. There's a huge amount of sort of anti-corporatism to it, which is a sort of form of anti-capitalism. It's certainly not socialism per se, because socialists actually sort of believe in something, whereas the anti-capitalists just hate big corporations.
I love
There's not
KFC.
a lot more to it.
I mean, I genuinely love. I will because someone said to me, like, comedians, you're not supposed to do adverts, right? Because that's selling out. And I thought, well, one, get fucked. I mean, if I'm getting off the advert, I'm doing it. And that's the good thing about me and me is I can happily do this stuff, and it's completely consistent with who I am. And in fact, the most dishonest thing for me to do would be to turn down an advert for KFC. Wouldn't that be like, because I want to look cool in front of my comedian mates, I actually lie and say, no, I don't have that, a minimum of 2 times a week. I have it 2 times a week. I love it. One thing I would say about KFC is that the chicken has got smaller. And if they're listening, I'm on to you. All right. There was this thing about like these mutant chickens. Do you remember all that? These alien chickens. They changed it to KFC because they weren't allowed to use chicken in the title. Do you remember that? This conspiracy theory. But then you were like, well, they mentioned chicken in the menu 26 times. Right? And then what I noticed is like under this banner of like, well, we're doing you all a favour. Chicken got a lot smaller. I'm like, you're not doing me a favour. Now I've had to. Well, basically, I used to have a 2-piece meal. I've had to go for a 3-piece meal now.
It's reformulation. It's Public Health England.
Shrinkflation.
Don't even blame KFC. This is all Public Health England.
I'm on
not
their
a conspiracy.
side. Get off the Colonel's back. He's just doing his best.
So if KFC is listening, they should both send Geoff a check and sort
Get
out
the
the size
alien
of the chicken.
mutant chickens back in. I want more bang for my buck.
Before we get into the final section of the podcast, I just wanted to let you know about a great way that you can support the podcast, you can support the show, get our message out there to more and more people that will cost you nothing and take just 1 minute of your time. All you've got to do is give us a rating and a review with your chosen podcast provider. It really is that simple, and it will be a huge help. So thanks so much for your support, and back to the show. So let's close up by talking about cannabis. So there's been a new study published by the University of Kent, which has found that there's no evidence that tough policies deter young people from using cannabis. So it's analysed data on cannabis use from about 100,000 teenagers in 38 countries. It said there's no association between more liberal policies and cannabis use at higher rates. And the news comes as Mexico appears set to become the third country after Uruguay and Canada to legalise entirely. We've also been watching over the last 10 years or so various US states implement these new kind of experiments in legalisation and decriminalisation. So in some ways it feels like that's the way that the wind is blowing. But Chris, what did you make of this particular study, and also where Britain is at the moment in terms of drugs policy and cannabis?
It rings true with me, yeah. It rings true with me. The experience in America seems to have been, insofar as there's a pattern, the evidence is fairly mixed. It seems to have been, in states that have legalised, you've seen adult consumption go up a bit and underage consumption go down a bit. And that's not particularly surprising. I mean, the under 21s aren't allowed to buy it, whether it's legal or not, right? So you can imagine that the legal suppliers are going to be a bit more fussy than your backstreet dealer. So it hasn't had a massive effect. And what's interesting, I think, about the cannabis legalization in America is this is the country that started the war on drugs, really. You know, they banned all this stuff, and then they got the UN to get the rest of the world to ban it. And large parts of America are pretty puritanical about cannabis and other issues. And yet, in the states that have legalized it, and they haven't all been places like California, they've been some fairly dry states have been legalizing it, it's just not been an issue afterwards. You know, it's been a lot of media around it and, you know, handing out the licenses and, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then it happens and you don't really hear any more about it. The government makes quite a lot of tax revenue. Consumption, as I say, amongst adults goes up a little bit maybe. Consumption against children goes down. Everyone's happy and nobody's really calling for it to be banned again.
So, Geoff, what's your take on the cannabis debate in general?
Well, I mean, it's a sign of where governments will go. Right? I mean, if you think now, I have some sort of sympathy for the sort of genetically modified forms of it that you get now, and there's a very hard form of drugs, but in its original form, it's called grass, right? Because it grew naturally. This is a thing that grows naturally, and governments went, oh no, we'll have some of that. You know what I mean? It's kind of bizarre. They would just step in and legislate there. I understand with certain synthetic drugs that are deliberately manipulated to cause ridiculous highs and stuff like that. You can see why governments might, want to get involved there. So I think that it's moving back towards a more natural state. And obviously, if they'd have legalised it then, right, you wouldn't even have had this issue of super strength skunk because that was to do with exporting and, like greater volumes and stronger volumes getting over borders. So you wouldn't even have had this issue. So it's just, I suppose, like you say, it's an example of where governments getting involved have really overcomplicated quite a simple thing. I think the other issue is where we're at as a country. I've always thought that one of the things that sort of militates against us legalising it is that, the first Prime Minister to do it will undoubtedly be photoshopped with a spliff on the front of the Sun and the Mirror and all these tabloid newspapers. So the question is that as their influence and as their sort of visible influence declines, will there come a point where that image, because it would be, if you think like in the mid-90s, that would have been a defining image of a Prime Minister, whether or not that...
I think that would improve Theresa May's image. Myself.
Well, I mean, she danced
point,
like shit, and that seems to help. So, I mean, the idea of... I mean, it might explain the dancing on some level. So, I mean, it's funny talking about it because cannabis, of all the drugs that I experimented with, that was the one that got me in most trouble, actually, in terms of psychologically. So, I am sort of aware of its potency. But, I've got a son now. The idea of him just being able to... I'd rather him be able to buy it somewhere regulated than have to meet some dodgy geezer in a Ford Capri or the modern equivalent of a Ford Capri.
Well, this is it as well. And Chris, you've made this point many times, which is there's this kind of vicious circle going on, is that there's more and more concern about, say, the psychological impacts of this. But a lot of that is down to prohibition and the fact over the past particularly 10, 20 years, you have seen these more potent strains which have developed on the black market, so it becomes this vicious cycles that potentially the effects of it become more heightened because there is no regulation, because it isn't legalised, like the moonshine effect, effectively, What should we say, particularly to those people who do have concerns about the psychological impact side of this? Is there something, can that be entirely counteracted by just having a kind of regulated market in this kind of thing?
Not entirely, because nothing's entirely safe, but you can dramatically improve things, I think. You're talking about the synthetic drugs and so on. The skunk that's on the streets now is virtually a synthetic drug. You're a Narcos fan, aren't you?
Yes,
right. So beginning of Narcos Mexico, they explain how they're breeding it.
Yeah, that's the only way that I know this stuff.
To make it super strong, and that's been going on in people's lofts all around Britain. They've just been crossbreeding it to get rid of as much. Well, this is inadvertent, but they've got rid of the CBD, which is the good stuff that's antipsychotic, and they've increased the amount of THC, which is gets you high, but it has bad side effects. It's not great. You can make you prone to paranoia and worse, and that is direct result of prohibition. It wouldn't have happened. It didn't happen when it was legal for thousands of years. I don't think it would have happened had it been legal the last 100 years. I don't think there's a lot of latent demand for skunk that absolutely blows your head off. There might be a bit more now because that's what people are used to. But
it's fun when you hear politicians say super skunk. That's I quite like the fact every once in a while they're forced into saying that. It feels so unnatural. These new strains of super skunk. People are getting well mashed on these, and it's time for the government to step in.
And I don't know if that puts anybody off using it, calling it super skunk. But anyway, it does undoubtedly have side effects, which I really don't think it used to have more than 20 years ago. It was just a fundamentally different drug. And it's absolutely the moonshine effect, but because it's now genuinely quite a risky substance, that gets your Peter Hitchenses and people to say, well, see, I told you, it's terribly dangerous. Well, it's your policies that made it dangerous. We need to unwind it. And what the prospects are in Britain, I don't know. I think that somewhere else in Europe will do it, and then eventually we'll follow along once it becomes clear that people are not opposed to
use the Remain voter logic. We just got to wait for old people to die, man. They're the problem. Like, you know what? You're like coming through a lot more puritanical. If anything, they'll start criminalising other stuff.
Well, it's interesting you talk about Peter Hitchens there, because he's self-described Puritan. He's the only one really holding the line on all of this stuff. It does feel like the argument that people in politics would always make is that they wouldn't want to upset the Daily Mail, they wouldn't want to upset the Sun. The Sun is sounding more sensible in these things these days. Is there a case that there is just a massive gap between what most ordinary people recognise that it's not that big a deal, but it's just this, this layer who are terrified of doing anything because of that front page?
You're right. Like when society's ahead of the curve, like it takes a long time for people to just catch up and think, most people are cool about this now. And I think that that tabloid culture, it's not as influential as it was, and as you say, what does exist is a lot more sort of temperate.
Another point is far fewer people were using cannabis than they were 20 years ago. I think that's probably a response actually to the fact that it's not as nice a drug anymore. But of course, the fewer users you have, the less pressure is to legalise it. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
And also something like Spice came totally out of that market. When at the end of my sort of cannabis smoking years, I bought Spice and used it simply because it became so hard to get hold of it as I was approaching middle age and didn't know the right people, that suddenly there was this version of it, and it was right at the beginning of designer drugs, that I thought, well, this is brilliant, I can just get it posted to my house. But like there was one time where there's an active component of it, and we just made one joint completely out of that, and it was ridiculous. and that was dangerous. Do you know what I mean? Like we had no idea of the strength of it. And like you say, that's another byproduct. One is the strength of the product itself, and one is other products coming onto the market to kind of sidestep its illegality.
Oh. Did it turn you into a zombie?
Well, I can see how that would. Do you know what I mean? We went out for like quite a fancy... I'm probably implicating people, shouldn't it? But we went out for quite a fancy brunch, and we departed after main starters. We was in an absolute state. We were really freaked out.
Geoff, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Do take a moment to give us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support Spike directly, please do consider making a donation. just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.